rocking her back and forth and feeling a burst of joy in his heart. She didn't hate him after all. She wasn't okay and she wouldn't be for a very long time. But they would get through this together. Finn's forehead was far too warm for comfort. He didn't know why little kids always got sick in the middle of the night, but he didn't care. What mattered was that his little boy wouldn't have to be sick all by himself. He got out a bucket and placed it in front of his son just in case, but Finn didn't seem to need it quite yet. He looked completely miserable. There was only one thing left to do. Did I ever tell you about the time I got stuck to meet Lug and flew out over the ocean? Finn giggled and shook his head. The young father regaled the boy with his story, throwing in as many details as he remembered. When describing the bizarre events surrounding his apology to Fishlegs, Finn was laughing so hard he very nearly threw up again. The father loved making his boy laugh. And the boy appreciated his father more every time he did. Easy does it, Addy. Let him come to you. He was talking to a 10-year-old girl with long, loosely braided hair and stunning green eyes. She had her arm extended, her eyes squeezed shut and her head facing away from the dragon mere inches from her hand. It hesitated for a moment before resting its snout on her outstretched fingers. Her eyes opened wide and her face split into a delighted smile. Her father stood back and watched her gently stroke the dragon, his heart bursting with pride. Slowly, Finn, I said slowly. He sighed deeply as he watched his son acquire his very first cut while shaving. The teenager had never liked to do things slowly and he scowled as he washed the blood off the razor and pressed a cloth up to his jaw. Yeah, I think I'm just going to grow a beard, he said in a voice that sounded an awful lot like his grandfather's. Feel free. But you're still going to learn how to shave. Finn glared up at his father, who shrugged before holding up the razor and demonstrating on his own face. If you're slow and careful, you won't get razor burn or cut your face. See how I'm moving it down my face? Always go down, not up. Now you try. The red-haired teenager sighed before picking up the razor and emulating his father's actions. To his great surprise, he didn't manage to nick his skin. In fact, his face hadn't been this smooth in a long time. There you go. See? Nothing to it. Finn rolled his eyes. I'm still growing that beard. He had almost hoped this day would never come. His daughter's arm was linked with his and every one of his fellow hooligans stood as they entered the great hall. He wanted to cry but he thought he should save it until the kiss. If he could hold out that long. The trip up the aisle seemed to fly by and now that they were up front, it was time to give his baby away. He turned to look at her. She was so beautiful, her round face smiling widely and her green eyes sparkling with joy. Her betrothed was blurred and in shadows but he didn't care because this was the perfect man for his little girl. He kissed her on the cheek and let her go. Hiccup's eyes snapped to focus. He didn't know how long he had been dead to Dagur, who was presently yanking on Toothless driving gear and yelling at him to land. Toothless continued to roar and jerk his head around in his attempt to see Hiccup and tear Dagur to pieces limb by limb. Dagur hadn't tossed him overboard yet. He probably wanted to toss his enemy's bloody body at Astrid's feet in smug pride. Hiccup could feel the agony in his body from head to toe, each bruise, each cut, each slash of his skin, each smear of his blood. But he wasn't done. He wasn't dead yet. And Odin and all the halls of Asgard curse him to hell if he allowed this maniac, this cursed fiend, this disgusting vial of all of Loki's minions to get his hands on his babies, his wife, his dragon, and his island. He might be dying. But still he wasn't dead. Tears welling up in his eyes both from the pain and from the realization that Dagur must die, he must take a life if it meant the safety of Berk and the Haddock heritage. Hiccup grabbed Dagur's tunic and pulled himself into a seated position. Dagur stared at him in shock. What? I'm sorry Dagur. Hiccup breathed into his face. But I can't let you win. Dagur made a move to grab the dagger sticking out of Hiccup's chest, but the hooligan quickly collided the berserker's nose with his forehead. Dagur cried out, recoiling back. Hiccup wrapped his right leg around the back of Dagur's left knee, pulled back and shoved Dagur forward. Dagur's leg slipped out from under him and he screamed in shock. He grabbed Hiccup's arm, pulling him over the edge with him. Hiccup's stomach slammed into Toothless' black hide and Dagur's hand slipped from his. Hiccup watched Dagur plummet toward the rocks below with wide eyes. Toothless yanked to a halt, hovering in place to watch the enemy fall. Dager screamed angrily, indignantly at first, then the more he fell, he screamed in terror. His Skrill didn't come. His men couldn't come. His only potential rescuers would not rescue him. Dager the deranged smashed into the rocks with a sickening crack that set Hiccup's teeth on edge. In a daze, he watched Dager lie there, completely unmoving, watched as the small pool of blood formed underneath Dager's head. How long he stared at the body he didn't know, but it was the flutter of his heart and the sudden struggle to breathe that snapped him back into action. With a groan of indignation he reached up and grasped his saddle. Toothless warbled to him, still unable to fully see his best friend. Hiccup wasn't well, his instincts and the smell of blood told him that much. Hiccup pulled himself back onto the saddle, barely managing to get his foot into the rigging. His vision clouded and he placed his forehead onto Toothless' neck. Toothless warbled again, still hovering in place. Astrid. Hiccup could only whisper. Just get me to Astrid, bud. Astrid watched a body fall off of Toothless, heard a horrible scream, and then all went silent. The Night Fury was flying at a breakneck speed toward land, steadily flying closer until the rider on its back was finally visible. Hiccup. She wanted to cry with relief. He had done it. He had won. After everything they had gone through, every moment she feared would be his last, he had protected his family. And he didn't have to die to do it. Or did he? The moment Toothless touched down, her husband slid off his back, landing with a dull thud on the dirt. Blood splattered on the ground around him and he remained still. Astrid gasped in horror. She wasn't even conscious of the fact that she had started walking forward until she had quickened her pace enough to run. She fell to her knees and gently lifted his upper body so that it rested on her lap. His eyelids fluttered. Dager's dead, he choked out, trembling slightly as more blood gushed out of his body. Astrid's shaking hand made its way to the hilt of the dagger sticking out of her husband's chest. She dearly wanted to pull it out, but a distant memory of something her mother had once said drifted into her subconscious and reminded her that jostling the weapon or pulling it out could be fatal. She looked into his eyes, relishing the sounds of his shaking, weak breathing. You did it. You won, she whispered, holding him close and feeling the warm blood running through her fingers. You've got to stay with me, Hiccup. Come on, don't you die on me now. People were running to and fro, a healer was probably being summoned. Toothless cooed in concern and nudged Hiccup's foot, but Astrid paid them no heed. Tears were falling thick and fast upon her face, dripping into her husband's blood and causing his features to become blurry. Hiccup raised a quivering hand and gently brushed the back of his fingers against her cheek. She reached up and gripped his wrist, holding it to her face and caking his wrist in his own drying blood. Stay with me, she breathed, stroking his shoulder with her other hand. Come on, Hiccup. Why, you can finally be there for our kids. And Emmy, don't you leave us now. Stay with me. The edges of Hiccup's mouth twitched upward slightly as he stared into her eyes. For a moment, the entire world was silent. They were the only ones in the universe, the only ones that mattered. But all moments, even the most precious ones, are fleeting. A few seconds later, the hooligan chief's body shuddered and then fell limp. His bright green eyes rolled upward and his eyelids fluttered shut. Astrid's heart stopped. Hiccup. Chapter 16, even. Chapter text. This couldn't be happening. Hiccup couldn't be dead. After everything they had gone through, everything they had faced, every tear they had shed together, this couldn't be how it ended. Her husband dead in her arms, his warm blood soaking her clothing. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The cry that came from Astrid caught everyone off guard. No one had ever heard a cry so anguished, so devoid of hope. No one wanted to watch her sobbing, her limp husband in her arms. The meathead's healer, a woman named Una, rushed forward, a few of her helpers and apprentices running behind her with a mat. Before Astrid could even react, she pushed her aside and immediately began to place her fingers on Hiccup's neck and up to his mouth. And then she did something that made Astrid gasp with horror and Toothless lunge forward. She slapped him. His eyelids fluttered in response and his body jolted again. He's alive, she put a hand on the young woman's shoulder. We have to get him to my house right now. She motioned for her entourage to put Hiccup on the mat. Astrid didn't want to let him go, but she knew that he needed urgent care. She and the others carried her husband to a thankfully nearby house. Toothless followed, limping behind them, and curled up outside the house, unable to fit through the door. They burst through it and lay him down on the bed. His blood seeped through the mat, creating crimson stains on just about everything it touched. Now that she could see him in a proper light, Astrid caught sight of his stomach weakly moving up and down. His arms and legs trembling. He was breathing. He was alive. Gobber came bounding through the doorway seconds later. Astrid had never seen him looking so worried. "He's alive?" he asked, his eyes boring into Astrid's. She nodded. Gobber, though still tense, seemed to loosen up a bit. He sat down on a nearby chair as Una and her assistants tended to the wounded chief. They cut away the leather coat to reveal the flight suit underneath. The dagger was sticking directly into Hiccup's heart, but there was a lump on the chest. The blood coming from beneath the strap seeped slowly, almost like the cut wasn't very deep. Una decided to take the risk and extract the dagger. The moment Astrid saw it, her legs gave out and she collapsed onto a chair. Only the dagger's tip was dripping with her husband's blood. Una cut away the strap and out fell a doll in a blue nightgown with a missing arm and leg and, now, a gaping hole in its center. Its back was covered in blood. But now the injury was revealed, it was shallow. Only about a centimeter deep, if that. Astrid covered her face with her hands, an explosion of relief and terror all coming out of her at once. Their little girl had saved her daddy's life. "We're going to have to stitch this up," Una said in a businesslike tone. "Josie, Cleo, you get the stitching materials and start working on his neck. Gobber, get a few of the stronger hooligans to hold him down. Astrid, talk to him. We can't let him pass out." She clapped her hands once. "Move." Instantly, there was a flurry of activity. The assistants named Josie and Cleo ran around, picking up the materials they needed. Una pressed down on Hiccup's injuries to try to slow the bleeding while she waited for them. Gobber ran out the door, was gone for a few seconds, and returned with Snotlout, Fish Legs, and Tough Nut, Fish Legs and Snotlout going over and holding down Hiccup's arms while Tough Nut and Gobber held down his legs. The moment Josie and Cleo returned with the materials, they slowly started working on Hiccup's neck. Hiccup gasped at the sudden pain. Astrid knew that there would be a scar there for the rest of his life. Una applied a thick bandage to his chest and another to his left arm and hand. The cut on the arm also needed stitching. Astrid, meanwhile, leaned over him, blocking his view of the procedures. Hiccup's eyes were half open and unfocused. What? I can't, why can't I? Hiccup whispered, incapable of raising his voice. Astrid slipped her hand into his. He suddenly clutched it so hard she was losing circulation. "It's okay, Hiccup. Everything's going to be okay. Astrid." Hiccup's weak voice went up in pitch. He had never sounded so terrified. She sat down next to him on the bed and gently ran her fingers through his thick hair. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Hiccup suddenly cried out in pain, or he would have done if he had a voice at all. All the treatments, everything pressing on him, the needles weaving through his skin, were agonizing. Tears brimmed in his eyelids, he tried to keep them down but a few slipped out. When the cry died in his throat, he squeezed Astrid's hand even harder. "Dad, where's Dad?" he rasped. Astrid let out a small sob, which she stifled and hoped her husband couldn't hear. He was disoriented, confused, in excruciating pain, she couldn't tell him. She turned to look at Gobber. They stared at each other for a split second before he nodded and gripped Hiccup's hand in his. The young chief seemed to find this comforting. Both Astrid and Gobber felt horribly guilty deceiving him in this way, but telling him the truth would hurt him much more. He whimpered for a few minutes, apparently satisfied that those he needed most were with him. The room became silent, everyone feeling slightly guilty about the deception but no one wanting to talk about it. Astrid gently ran her fingers through Hiccup's hair. Sweat and blood, some of it daggers, came off in her fingers. She felt like gagging but restrained herself. Even if he could barely feel it, her husband needed her comforting touch while he was stitched up. His eyelids continued to flutter but they remained open. He was trying to say something else but no sound came out. Shh, don't speak. Just lay still. It's going to be over soon. Astrid whispered, kissing him on the forehead. It was over in a few minutes but it felt like a lot longer. The dark stitches all over Hiccup's body made Astrid cringe. They were rough to the touch and would probably stay for several days as the skin healed. Her husband looked the worst she had ever seen him, and this included the aftermath of the fight with the Red Death. But it didn't matter in the long run. He would be scarred for the rest of his life, but he had a life to live. The sun was high in the sky when a terrible terror came sailing into the great hall. It immediately landed on Lotus and stuck out its foot, revealing a rolled-up message. She slipped it off and unfurled it as the dragon flew away. After a few seconds, she laughed out loud, tears streaming down her face. It's over. Hiccup won, she called. Oh, thank Thor. A hush fell over the crowd. Lotus saw the faces of her grandchildren, one white as a sheet and the other red and wet. They both seemed to be in shock. After all the worrying and crying, this was the moment for which they had prayed. Suddenly, several shouts of joy erupted from the hooligans all at once and the tension in the hall evaporated completely. It was Finn who regained the ability to move first. He jumped off the bench on which he was seated and ran to Lotus, wanting to tug the note out of her hand and try to read it. He needed proof that his daddy was truly alive. The moment he saw the parchment, he knew. It was his mommy's handwriting. She would never lie about this. His daddy didn't die after all. He looked over at his sister, who was staring at him with wide eyes, and gave her a thumbs up. He's okay. Eric exclaimed, smiling widely and gripping Adriana's hand. Your daddy did it. Adriana had no idea how to react. She felt like laughing but she couldn't stop crying. It was like a giant burden had been lifted off her shoulders but a deep, desperate longing rose up within her. She continued to hold Eric's hand, more out of habit than anything else, as she hopped off the bench and ran to Lotus as fast as she could. Can we go now? She asked, wiping her face with the back of her hand. I want to see Daddy. Please. Your mom would rather you two wait a little while. She says he got hurt and needs his rest. Lotus replied in a gentle voice. She'll let us know when you can come. But he needs me. Adriana protested. I won't bother him. Me neither, piped up Finn. What your daddy needs now is rest. Lotus said firmly. But he's alive and he's going to be okay. That's what matters, isn't it? Adriana bit her lip but nodded. Eric squeezed her hand and nodded his head toward some of the other children, who had sat down to play a game. Finn, upon noticing this, bounded over and joined them. It's okay, Anna. Your dad's going to be okay. He just needs rest. Eric smiled at his best friend, taking her other hand and facing her directly. But you need to have fun. Adriana looked at her other friends, who all looked quite happy, and finally smiled at Eric. Okay, she mumbled. Lotus watched her granddaughter and the Larson boy join the game, her eyes furrowed and her jaw clenched. True, Hiccup was alive but according to the note, he was completely bedridden. Was he disfigured? Would he be disabled for the rest of his life? Well, more disabled. There were so many uncertainties, so many questions, so many difficulties that they would face over the next few days, if not weeks. But one thing was for certain, Dagur the Deranged would never return to Berk to torture its inhabitants again. And that was all that mattered. It had been the most agonizing several days of Astrid's life. When Hiccup was finally allowed to go to sleep, he looked completely peaceful. She, on the other hand, was still feeling tense. She wanted her children back in her arms. She wanted to spend every moment with her husband, making sure he was safe. She wanted to put this whole nightmare behind her. Dagur's body was recovered within an hour of the end of the duel. The Berserkers had a private funeral and burned it that evening. The only Berserker who seemed truly heartbroken was Dagur's sister, who Astrid later found out was the only one left in the family. She couldn't imagine having no one left. But it was either that or lose her entire home and family. She wasn't about to let that happen. Letters of support from the hooligans poured in while Hiccup was unconscious. A lot of them said roughly the same thing, that the writer had known that Hiccup would defeat Dager and save Burke from the Berserkers. Astrid didn't believe for a minute that any of them were genuine. She appreciated the letter she got from her mother, however, which said that both her children were anxious to visit their father. Una told her that once Hiccup awoke and was showing signs of improvement, he would be permitted to have visitors other than Astrid. Hiccup woke up several days after the ordeal. Astrid was reading the updated Dragon book on a chair next to his bed, completely immersed in the Typhumarang section, when she heard him stir slightly. Hiccup, her head popped up and she immediately put the book aside and sat on the bed next to him. "How are you doing?" His eyes opened and he stared at her for a few seconds. "Thirsty?" he rasped. Astrid took a skin of water off the table next to him and carefully tipped it toward his mouth. He drank it down and then licked his lips, relishing the feeling of moisture in this throat and mouth. "You feeling any better?" Astrid put the empty skin down and felt his forehead, her fingers brushing up against his hair. "A lot better." Hiccup scooted himself upwards a bit so that he could look at her more easily. His eyes finally focused and he noticed that she seemed tense about something, biting her lip and using her free hand to smooth out his shirt. It was like she couldn't sit still. "Are you okay?" "Me? Yes. I'm okay," Astrid replied, her fingers edging into his hair now. "What about Toothless? He was bitten, did they?" Gobber and a few of the others bandaged him up. "He's going to be fine," she assured him. "He's resting in the pen by the house right now. I'll wake him up in a minute." Hiccup nodded. "Good, good." He looked down at his legs and wiggled his remaining toes. "Okay, so I didn't lose another foot, that's good. Always good to keep your limbs intact," he added with a smile. Astrid breathed a laugh. "Gobber's in the forge working on another prosthetic. He's almost finished. Says he has a brilliant design." "Well, that's reassuring. I still haven't forgotten about Ed. Hang on, what about the kids? Are they okay? Are they here?" Hiccup looked around expectantly, almost like he thought he would spot them hiding in the room, ready to jump out and greet him when he caught them. "They're fine. My mom sent a terrible terror. She says they want to see you but the healer said you need rest. When you're feeling better, we'll send for them." Astrid explained, moving her hand down to gently stroke his cheek. "Send for them? I just want to see them." "Sure." Astrid kissed his forehead. "Just let yourself heal. That's most important." For the first time, Hiccup noticed how many stitches were on his arms. He even felt the rough ones in his neck, making it painful to turn his head. Suddenly, he remembered something incredibly important. He put a hand up to his heart and winced as he applied a little bit of pressure to the bandage. "Dager stabbed me," his eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What, why am I not dead?" Astrid handed him Mr. Gobcup. She had stitched the hole in the doll shut but no amount of washing would take out the brown blood stains on its back. Hiccup ran his finger down the stitches on both ends, his eyes wide with awe. He wanted to react, but he didn't know what he felt. No tears would come. Yet he didn't feel like smiling either. "Addie," he mumbled, still running his finger up and down the stitched part of the doll. "My Addie. She saved your life." Astrid blinked a few times, suddenly feeling very emotional. "Looks like you're finally even." "That's no surprise." Hiccup smiled, his heart aching for his little girl. "She makes my life worth saving." He reached up and brushed her bangs out from in front of Astrid's eyes. "And you make it worth living." Astrid leaned down to kiss him, closing her eyes and welcoming the feeling of his lips against hers. It was bliss like she had never felt it before, the confirmation she needed that her husband would, in fact, recover and be there for her and the twins. Her heart began to pound and as she pulled away, she had to wipe her eyes a few times. "Come here," Hiccup whispered, scooting over so that there was room for her on the bed. Astrid lay down, fully clothed, thankfully without her armored skirt, and allowed her husband's body to warm her from the outside in. She loved him more than life itself, but now that their worst fears had not come to pass, now that they were free to be together and raise their children, she began to relax. Within seconds, she was fast asleep. Hiccup, however, wasn't quite ready to join his wife in slumber. He watched her for a few minutes, gently stroking her hair so that it wouldn't fall in front of her face. A part of him thought that this had to be a dream. There was no way he had managed to save everyone from the strongest fleet in the archipelago, no way he had taken down Dagur the Deranged, except he was awake. It wasn't a dream. And as happy as he was that things would soon go back to normal, the image of Dagur's body, still and bloody, would not leave his subconscious. It was necessary. It was unavoidable. Hiccup knew these things. He knew there was no other option. Yet he also knew that it would be a long time before he could truly put this ordeal behind him. Chapter 17, Reunion. Chapter text. It would be nearly a day of sailing before Finn and Adriana would arrive on Braun. The day Una decided that Hiccup was well enough for visitors, the children were summoned, as were the other chiefs. Since the chiefs were arriving on dragons, the nasty business of changing the law wouldn't take much time and they would be long gone by the time the twins arrived. As chief of the Berserkers and the Hooligans, Hiccup felt that he deserved the option of hosting the meeting in the healer's house. His stump had mostly healed but he still limped quite a bit and he needed to stay in bed most of the day. He was hoping he would recover soon because being bedridden was very boring, especially without the twins, though the Thorsten twins did provide a little bit of entertainment. There were 10 chiefs crammed into the small room and crowding around Hiccup's bed. The Hooligan and Berserker chief had already drawn up an official document stating that any child born outside of his or her parents' home island is a citizen of both his or her parents' home and the island on which he or she was born. The vote was, as required by law, unanimous and all 10 chiefs signed the document into law. Now this situation would never happen again and the archipelago would likely face a quieter period of time without any violent tribes to stir up trouble. There would be disagreements, certainly, but no wars anytime soon. At least not until someone's offspring proved to be a deranged sociopath. And the odds of that were minuscule. Or so Hiccup hoped. You do realize that you just changed Inga's nationality, don't you? Astrid asked with a smile when the last foreign chief finally left the house. Oh yeah. I guess that makes her half meathead, doesn't it? Hiccup chuckled. Well, if they're as friendly to her as they are to me, she'll fit in pretty well. I'm glad you think we're friendly. Kara sighed deeply and sat down on a chair propped up against a wall. That reminds me, Kara, do you want a new tribe? Hiccup asked quite seriously. Because I do not want any more people in mine. It's hard enough with the people I've got. Can you do that? Kara asked, getting out the law book and flipping through it. Yeah. It's a clause underneath the dual one, which I think is on page 12. Hiccup pointed to the law in his own book, which he had just gotten out. If, however, the victor does not seek acquisition, as an alternative, he may designate an Asini to officiate the tribe. And you think I would want it? I just had a baby. Kara exclaimed, shaking her head vehemently. Hiccup shrugged. It was worth a shot. Is there anyone here that you think would make a good chief? I'd almost consider appointing Snotlout, but something in my gut tells me that it wouldn't be a good idea to give him that much power. And I don't think Fishlegs would want to do it. That and if he died suddenly before Helga turns 17, Roughnut would be chief. Everyone paused to allow that statement to sink in. There was a collective shudder. What about my brother? Kara suggested. He's a year younger than me, already has an heir, and he's a really good leader. He could whip those berserkers into shape in no time. Hiccup furrowed his eyebrows. He didn't know Sven very well, but the meathead had been undeniably helpful. He had even come by a few times to check up on how Hiccup was doing. He came from a chief's family, everything seemed to click. If you can vouch for him, he said slowly, his mind racing. I can. Our father taught him well, just in case something happened to me. Kara smiled. Now that I have my daughter, it doesn't look like he'll ever take over here. Why waste all that training? Why indeed, it seems kind of easy, don't you think? Astrid asked, putting her chin in her hands. We need a chief and Sven just happens to be the perfect candidate. I feel like there should be a catch. Or maybe this is the god's blessing. Kara countered. The only blessings I need are on their way here. Hiccup shifted positions, wincing as his weight fell on one of his many injuries. And I'm going to be there to greet them. Oh no you're not. Astrid glared at him. Hiccup rolled his eyes. I get up to go to the outhouse, how is this different? No one greets you on the way out. Yeah, way to make that awkward. Hiccup raised an eyebrow. Look, if they see me lying here, they'll worry too much. And if they irritate one of your injuries? Hiccup shook his head. I'll live. Astrid, when they were born, didn't you want to hold them right away? Astrid crossed her arms. What does that have to do with anything? Because I just went through agonizing pain for them and now I want to hold them as soon as I possibly can. Hiccup tried to lift himself off the bed. I just need to get the hang of walking again. His wife bit her lip for a few seconds before helping him up. Their eyes met and in a moment, she understood his insistence. After everything he had gone through, everything they had gone through, the very people for whom they were defending and protecting would be with them once more. And they needed a daddy who wasn't bedridden and weak. They needed a daddy who could wince with the pain of his injuries but still stand firm. No foul, disgusting monsters, be they the elements or man or even dragons, would ever dare to try and take them away again. And if Hiccup had to die to keep them safe, he would do it in a heartbeat. But not today. Today, he was victorious. Today he would remind himself of why he was fighting. Today he would walk to the dock, no matter how difficult it was, and greet his children the moment they arrived. Finn hopped from one foot to the other in anticipation. Brawn's Shore was on the horizon at last. After hours of boring games that didn't keep anyone truly entertained, he would be visiting his first foreign tribe. Of course, he knew he had been to Berserker Island but, naturally, he couldn't remember that so this would have to count. Most people didn't get to visit other islands until they had their own dragons. This would make him quite popular with the big kids. Adriana, on the other hand, was a little bit nervous. It wasn't that she didn't want to see her daddy, she did more than anything, but she felt uneasy. All she had heard was that her father was bedridden and that they weren't allowed to see him until he had healed enough. She had spent her 5th birthday with Eric, they had discovered an old, forgotten bridge and pretended they were trolls living beneath it. All things considered, it hadn't been a bad birthday at all. But she had a feeling that life, however unpredictable it was at the best of times, would never go back to normal. There was something tugging at her heart, a feeling that she was missing a crucial piece of information, but she was determined not to let this feeling dominate her. As Brawn's Shore grew ever closer, both children could see their parents standing a little ways from the dock. They thought it was odd that their father kept moving his hand to his face from time to time. It was Adriana who first realized that this was because he was crying. This added to her uneasiness. Finn, however, was more focused on his mother, who had both hands up to her face like she was so overwhelmed, she had to hide it. The boy wondered why grown-ups, especially women, did that when they had strong feelings. Would their feelings pour out of their mouths if they didn't cover it? He would have to remember to ask his mommy when everything had quieted down. Adriana didn't bother to wait until the boat was fully docked. She had waited long enough. The girl hopped out of the boat when she was close enough and ran at full speed to her father, who had gotten down on his knees and expectantly stretched out his arms. When she got closer, she stopped and stared. The first thing she noticed was the giant, jagged red mark going down the length of her daddy's neck. Her mouth dropped open, it was a horrible, ugly mark. What kind of monster could ever put a mark like that on the strongest man in the world? Her heart was pounding rather loudly as she took in the sight of the healing cuts on his hands and one on his face. She had known that he was hurt, but now that she could see him, she was terrified. It almost felt like he wasn't her daddy anymore. Like he was a stranger who looked like him. Like her daddy would jump out from behind a rock and startle her, tell her he was kidding, but this man was hurt. He didn't feel like the strongest man in the world anymore. And there was a darkness in his eyes, a tiny glimmer of something that wasn't there before. She didn't like it one bit. "Addie," he muttered so that only she could hear. "It's okay, sweetie." She took a step forward, blinking rapidly to ease the burning sensation in her eyes. The closer she got, the more the injuries stuck out. But something else happened as well. Once she was close enough to touch him, she immediately put aside her concerns. A broken daddy was better than no daddy at all. She reached up and wiped away the tears that were falling down his face. "Don't cry, Daddy. I'm here," she said with a small smile. The youngest haddock took one more step forward and gently wrapped her arms around his neck. She rested her little blonde head on his shoulder and felt his strong arms ensconce her. She let out a sigh of contentment. She knew her daddy loved her, but there was something different about the way he held her now. Ever since her ordeal with Trista, he tended to hold her possessively, sometimes so tight it almost hurt but never so tight that it did. This wasn't that kind of hug. His hands, scarred by whatever beastly things that had been done to them, were gentle, his right embedded in her hair and his left stroking her back. And there was something about the feeling of his heart beating inside of his chest that was, for lack of a better word, different. Maybe it was beating a little bit faster than it usually did. She wasn't entirely sure, but she also didn't much care. Her daddy was alive. "Addie," he whispered. "My Addie, thank you." Adriana leaned back so that she could look her father in the eye. "For what?" Hiccup smiled. "Just for being my little girl." She wiped away the remaining tears on his face and focused her gaze on the ugly mark on his neck. She reached out and gingerly brushed her fingers against it. She had hardly touched it, but he still winced and made a quiet hissing noise with his teeth. It was real. Her daddy had been mangled and now it was up to her to make him feel better. But not right this second. She stepped back to allow her brother to have some time with their daddy. Finn, who had been feeling very impatient, immediately rushed forward and threw his arms around Hiccup's neck. His daddy made a funny sound, kind of like the one he made when Toothless stepped on his stomach. The boy loosened his hold. "Thanks, buddy." Hiccup choked, feeling suddenly breathless. "Gotta be a little gentle with your old man for a bit." Finn took a step back and eyed his father with an almost critical gaze. He took in all the funny red marks on his daddy's neck and hands and thought about it for a moment. "Did you fall down the stairs?" he asked quite seriously. For some reason, almost all of the grown-ups burst out laughing. Finn didn't understand this at all. It had been a legitimate question. His daddy fell down an awful lot. Not quite, Finster." Hiccup chortled. "But it doesn't matter. You're here. Thank you." Finn furrowed his eyebrows. "What did I do?" "You gave me strength when I needed it," his daddy replied, ruffling his hair. "Daddy," he exclaimed, making a face and shaking his head to undo the damage. There was a sudden sound of low growls coming from the forest. Before either children could react, Toothless and Stormfly emerged and immediately cooed with delight at the sight of their humans young. They had begun to think their humans had forgotten about them and were half considering reminding them. Toothless immediately bounded to the female young while Stormfly made a beeline to the male. Toothless affectionately licked the girl's face while Stormfly attempted to herd the boy toward his mother. The girl giggled, hiccuped, and wiped her face with her hand. The boy looked slightly disgruntled but decided to obey the dragon anyway. Now was as good a time as any to latch onto his mommy. The other Vikings, which included all of Hiccup and Astrid's friends, watched the reunion with smiles. Snotlout wiped a few tears out of his eyes. He would vehemently deny having done this a few hours later. But Gobber watched the scene unfold with a funny little smirk. "Well, looks like the family is whole again," he commented loudly enough for the haddocks to hear. "At least until the next crisis." "There won't be another crisis," Hiccup replied, kissing Adriana on the forehead, and regretting this instantly when he tasted dragon saliva. Unfortunately, life has a tendency to throw unexpected crises at its victims without any warning. And the next few years would prove Hiccup's words woefully wrong. "You're absolutely certain you want to give away the strongest fleet in the archipelago to a man you barely know?" Sven quipped as he looked at the official document in his hands. "You could still assign bodyguards for your children. It sounds like they need them." "I have never been more certain about anything," Hiccup drawled. "One tribe is enough. And I've got a couple of kids who need their daddy to be a bit more available." Adriana looked up at Sven with wide eyes and nodded, silently pleading him to sign the parchment so that her already frazzled daddy would have more time to spend with his family. "Well, if you insist." Sven raised the charcoal. "Wait!" Finn exclaimed, hopping up from his chair next to Hiccup's bed. I could be chief there. Astrid chuckled. We already went over this, little man. You're going to be chief of Berk. Finn wrinkled his nose. Yeah, but not for a long time. And Berk doesn't have a big army. He turned to his sister. Anna could be Berk's chief. Adriana shook her head. Nope. I want to make people happy. If I was chief, I'd have to make them bored and sleepy. Hiccup snorted. Well, thanks a lot, Addy. You're welcome. Adriana smiled, completely missing the sarcasm. Like I said, Sven'll do a great job. Kara spoke up, walking up to her brother and squeezing his shoulder. Ready to take on the job you were trained to do? Sven and Kara looked at each other for a moment. Yeah. I got this. Sven grinned in an almost mischievous way and signed the parchment. Now I can send an army to check up on you kids and make sure you're listening to your parents. Finn's eyes widened in horror and he immediately jumped up and threw his arms around Astrid's legs. I always listen to my parents. All three of his human family members laughed at what was possibly the biggest lie ever to escape the boy's lips. Even the dragons looked amused. Looks like the next order of business is talking to your new battalion. Kara patted her brother on the back. Maybe you can assign some of them on bread making or sewing or, hey, laundry duty. You may never have to wash your own skivvies again. Oh yes, that was the first thing on my mind when I signed this parchment. An army getting together to wash my clothes. Thank you for helping me sort out my priorities. Sven deadpanned. Now it's about time I break it to them that I don't intend to lead them into battle over someone else's children. Unless we're protecting them. That's what I wanted to hear. Hiccup encouraged him. Now get out there and lead them with an iron fist. But you don't lead your people with an iron fist. Adriana said, eyeing her father's calloused hands. That's because he leads them with an iron foot. Finn supplied, rolling his eyes as if this was the obvious thing in the world. Sven laughed and shook his head as he walked out the door, Kara at his heels. Una bustled in moments later, her hands full of clean bandages. Hiccup winced. Oh, don't be silly, I haven't even started yet. She smiled fondly at the wounded chief. I just need to clean out the injuries and apply fresh bandages where needed. You're healing very well. I'm glad. I'd hate to think I'd inconvenience you by not healing fast enough. Hiccup quipped with a smile, holding out his arm so that she could take off his bandage. You have been a rather entertaining patient, so it'll be a bit sad to see you go. Una relented, narrowing her eyes at him and smirking ever so slightly. Addy. Hiccup turned to his daughter, who was sitting next to him on the bed. Would you hold my hand? Adriana stared at his hand for a moment before nodding and gripping it rather tightly. Her daddy winced as Una cleaned the horrible wound on his neck. Adriana squeezed his hand. He had held her hand during many painful healing procedures. It was time she returned the favor. And though he never said it, she knew that he appreciated this small gesture more than even she could comprehend. The twins wanted to sleep in the healer's house. Una insisted that they sleep somewhere more comfortable. When it became dark, they were herded to Kara's house by a very pleased Stormfly. Toothless, however, stayed behind. He finally found a way to squeeze through the door and pushed his head upward under Hiccup's hand. The young chief smiled as he stroked it, feeling a lot more carefree than he had in weeks. But something continued to nag him. I can't tell them, he admitted to Astrid a few minutes later. I don't want them ever thinking it's okay to take someone's life. You didn't have a choice. Astrid reassured him, placing a hand on his chest. They'll understand that. Hiccup remained silent for a moment before speaking again. I don't think Addy would ever forgive me. Not after what she's seen. Astrid considered this for a few seconds. That's why you're making a miniature flight suit for her doll, isn't it? She'll love it. Hiccup said with a small smile. And I'll sew it on so she can't take it off and see the blood. Kind of a big risk, don't you think? Astrid asked, gently nudging him. She might decide to make her own outfit for it. I don't think it'll be a problem, her husband replied. But the kids can't know. It's hard enough living with myself after what happened. You didn't have a choice, Hiccup. I know. Hiccup nodded. But I still killed a man. I have to live with that for the rest of my life. But the kids don't have to live with that. I'd rather keep it that way. Astrid snuggled into him, her eyes drooping. I still think you did the right thing. Hiccup sighed deeply, putting an arm around his wife and feeling his muscles relax. They're worth it. I just hope I never have do something like that again. Astrid gave him a quick kiss before rolling over and allowing him to pull her closer to his body. I hope so too. He had done the right thing. He knew this in his head. And in his heart, he knew that he wouldn't have done anything different. But, as he felt Astrid fall asleep in his arms, he had a nagging feeling that life as they knew it was about to change. Chapter 18, A New Normal. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Hiccup liked Braun quite a bit, but he was beginning to tire of it after several weeks. And even more annoying was the fact that most of his time was spent with the healer. But all things must come to an end, and it was finally time to take off and fly home. The children were delighted when he and Astrid told them that they would be allowed to fly home with them. Seeing as she had already ridden Toothless, Adriana opted to travel home on Stormfly. This left Finn with Hiccup. The flight to Berk was invigorating for all of the Haddocks, Hiccup especially. Seeing as his last flight had ended with him nearly dying, it was about time he had a pleasant one. And with Finn laughing in delight in front of him, it was a good flight indeed. As Berk became visible on the horizon, Hiccup realized he had been slightly tense ever since leaving. He relaxed his muscles and took a deep sigh. Home had never looked so wonderful. The moment they touched down, a cheer rose from the crowd of Vikings waiting for them to arrive. Hiccup was given a hero's welcome and, considering how much he had gone through to get it, he wasn't complaining. He looked over at Astrid who, despite her wide smile, looked slightly annoyed. She never did like being in the center of an adoring crowd. The twins, on the other hand, were thrilled. Finn was delighted to note that some of the bigger kids looked very jealous. He would have to regale them with stories about Braun, including a description of a frog he'd found there that he'd never seen on Berk. Adriana's eyes scanned the crowd and she finally spotted Eric, pushed aside by a lot of the adults and bigger kids but looking happy that his best friend was home. She leaped off of Stormfly and stumbled a bit before running toward him and throwing her arms around him. He very nearly fell backward with the force of the hug, but he cheerfully returned it. The moment he had touched down, Snotlout made a beeline for Heather and lifted his little daughter out of her arms before kissing her. Astrid looked over and watched the couple interact for a few minutes. She couldn't help but notice that Heather was positively glowing and she had a strong feeling that there was a very wonderful reason. She would have to wait and see. Lotus announced that there would be a party in the Great Hall to celebrate Hiccup's return and the twins and Astrid's birthdays. Astrid had almost forgotten about her own birthday and rolled her eyes as they were herded toward the hall by a group of excitable Vikings and dragons. It seemed like there was always a reason for celebration on Berk. Perhaps Stoic's recent death had made everyone more determined to enjoy life. Or, more likely, maybe the hooligans liked a good party. Either way, this was an excellent reason to get out the mead and celebrate the return of the chief and his family. As they finally got to the Great Hall, questions started pouring in. The hooligans begged for details on the fight and Hiccup was elusive as he could with little ears listening. Thankfully, Finn was distracted by telling a jealous-looking Edgar about his adventure on Braun, and Adriana had managed to find some chocolate mint cookies on the other end of the hall. She was pulling Eric toward them so fast, the boy had to jog to avoid losing an arm. It took about 2 hours of constantly reiterating the details of the duel with Dager, but the mood in the hall finally calmed enough to allow Hiccup time to relax a bit with some mead. He still wouldn't touch the wine that had once gotten him drunk enough to call his father a yak. Astrid put her arms around him and rested her head on his shoulder. The sun was just beginning to set and the numerous candles were starting to become a fire hazard as usual. There was silence at the table containing the chief and his wife, Roughnut, Fishlegs, Snotlout, Heather, and the newly married Toughnut and Svala. Everyone looked slightly sheepish, all of them staring into their mead except Heather, who had abstained. Finally, Hiccup looked up and decided that now was as good as any to voice the idea that had been floating around in his brain for a few days. My dad always said that a good chief delegate's responsibilities, he began in a voice so commanding, he even surprised himself. I can't do everything my dad did when he was chief. There aren't enough hours in the day and I have twice as many kids as he did. He looked over at the twins, who were still completely immersed in what they were doing. I almost died and the only things I could think about were the people and dragons. Not the meetings and duties that come with being chief. Just the residents. I want to be able to spend time with them. I want to do what my dad never could. He looked back to the group, whose eyes were now on him. I want to get to know my people. And you're going to need help. Fishlegs continued. You're going to need to divide duties so you have the time. Yes. Hiccup nodded. But I can only do that if the council. We'll do it. Snotlout interrupted. Whatever it is you need us to do. We should have believed in you, said Fishlegs, looking very guilty. We won't doubt you again. Snotlout finished. And I'll take down anyone who questions your judgment again. Well. Astrid smirked. Not anyone, someone has to be the voice of reason. Every once in a while she nudged her husband, who smiled appreciatively. Toothless interrupted the discussion by running over and licking Hiccup's face. Gah! Hiccup shouted over the peals of laughter. Thanks, bud. I think. Toothless crooned happily and brushed against his rider in a cat-like fashion, snaking his head under Hiccup's arm so that he would be forced to pet him. Someone's being an attention hog. Hiccup scratched Toothless behind the ears. Have I been ignoring you for too long? Or are you just hungry? Toothless snorted smoke at this outrageous accusation, and then realized that he might be a little hungry. He gurgled expectantly. Oh, all right, you big baby. Hiccup chuckled. Give me a second and I'll. Got your tail, shouted a high-pitched voice behind the peckish dragon. Toothless turned to see the male young, both little hands grasping his tail and a gleam of mischief in his eyes. The female young was watching him, giggling behind her hand. They weren't going to get away with this. He lunged at them, his hunger forgotten, and began to chase them all over the hall. They ran as fast as they could, laughing with glee. Hiccup watched this scene for a few seconds before turning back to the group. I'm going to officially meet with the council about it, but I thought, since there are 20 of you, you could all take up one specific chief duty each. I think dividing it evenly eliminates anyone's chances of being too overworked. We'll support you no matter what. Rough Nut said in an uncharacteristically encouraging tone. Tough Nut leaned forward excitedly. Yeah. I'd support anyone who fought like that. Did you see when he tripped Dager up and kicked him in the... We all saw and it was awesome. Rough Nut continued. You should fight more often. Does anyone else want to challenge you? I volunteer. Tough Nut. Okay. What time should I be there? Tough Nut asked, earning himself an elbow in the ribs from his new wife. I think Hiccup's had enough dueling for a while, Tuffy. Svala kissed him on the cheek. Tough Nut looked slightly disappointed but brightened up when Svala used the opportunity to put her arms around him and rest her head on his shoulder, much like Astrid had with Hiccup. The table was silent again as everyone watched their children play, and Tough Nut and Svala became more cuddly. Finn and Adriana were still running away from Toothless, laughing loudly as he galloped after them. All three seemed to be having a very good time. Hiccup was beginning to feel rather warm inside. His family was safe. His children were happy. His people were united and supportive. He still felt a twinge of grief in his heart that he suspected would never go away when he thought of his father. Stoic would have loved to see this. To see his son defending his people, protecting his grandchildren, but perhaps he already had. Hiccup had a strong feeling that his father wasn't completely gone. He smiled as he watched his children run up to a large wooden beam and separate, each running around it on the opposite side. Bam! Toothless reeled back, partially because of the blow to his head but also from extreme annoyance. Whose bright idea was it to put a wooden beam in the middle of the room? He growled irritably but no one heard it. The Vikings and dragons were all focused on a completely different sound. Hiccup had nearly fallen off the bench. His loud guffaws echoed off the walls of the hall and drowned out just about any other noises coming from within. His face became bright red and tears streamed down his cheeks, but, for some reason, he simply could not stop laughing. The hooligans all stopped for a moment to watch their chief finally fall out of Astrid's arms, overwhelmed by his own laughter. Toothless shot Hiccup an irritated glare, but this only made the Viking laugh harder. Astrid laughed at the sight of her husband, who didn't seem to care how ridiculous he looked. The twins joined in because they rarely got to see their daddy laugh that hard, and they thought it was an interesting sight indeed. Within a few minutes, his guffaws were punctuated by loud hiccups. Adriana looked even more delighted. It was in that moment that the hooligans knew that, while things would never go back to the way they were, everything was going to be just fine. They still grieved for Stoic, still felt his absence, but it was time to move on. Time to laugh again. Time to enjoy life and cherish every precious second of happiness. As the Haddocks laughed until they all came down with the hiccups and Toothless shot them all death glares, the tension eased and life, no matter how unpredictable it could be, had become wonderful once again. This is Berk. It's the home of some of the toughest creatures in the whole of the archipelago. And I'm not just talking about the dragons. My father always said that a leader isn't born, he is made. He said it often, but I never truly understood what it meant until now. The journey has been rough, and I know there are always going to be difficulties ahead. That's all part of life. But my father left me with one more lesson to learn. It's that life is precious. We never know what's going to jump in and stir up trouble. No one knows how long we have to spend on this earth. And so we shouldn't waste a single second. In nearly dying, I have learned to live. And I intend to live to the fullest, to take hold of each moment and turn it into something memorable. It won't be easy. I know that for sure. But we'll get through whatever life throws our way. We always do. The end.